My next question is around, and it relates to what you were just talking about on the transparency side. I watched your testimony before the Modernization Committee, and you
Mhm.
were on a panel with some others who were less enthusiastic about transparency than you were.
Mhm.
On the one side, there's an ideal of some people's ideal of everything in Congress being completely transparent to the world, and including delving into the thoughts of each member and staffer. And on the other side, it seems that there's a nostalgia for times when people could get together in private conversations, and that's when compromise would happen, and people can give and take in an environment where uh, they don't have to pander to a particular small minority in their home district. And so I'd like to get your perspective on that, especially when a lot of people talk about this idea that some of the transparency benefits some of the special interests more than benefits your average person, right? The average person isn't going to go in and look at all the detail, but a small advocacy group or a special interest might. So I'm curious how your thoughts have evolved on this topic over the years.
Yeah, so I think that analysis is a fundamentally ahistorical reading of what happened in the past. So the way it used to be is that the special interest would go and whisper in the chairman of the committee's ear, and the chairman of the committee would do what the special interest wants. And the committee proceedings would be closed. There would be no transcript, there would be no record, there would be no report on the deliberations, and there probably wouldn't be a vote. So in the days of old, when knights were bold, transparency wasn't invented. The way Congress worked was all the smoke-filled rooms. Like that, I mean, that phrase literally comes from that era. Like that's how it worked. It was transparency largely that made the legislature more democratic. So, for example, if it wasn't for transparency, the Southern Democrats would have retained control over the House. The Southern Democrats didn't want anti-lynching legislation to move. They didn't want the modern civil rights legislation to move, and they bottled it up. And most of the Democratic members of the chamber started working together through the Democratic Study Group, and they forced changes into the House rules that required things like the committees must meet, the committees must hold a vote, the votes must be recorded. If you file a discharge petition, the number of people who've signed onto it isn't secret. So you could see when you're actually about to force a measure out of the committee and the committee chair is about to lose. Transparency is what empowered reform of the system so that we could actually have a modern democracy and not the Jim Crow South running things forever. So people who say, oh, well, when things were more secret, things worked better, they probably looked a lot like me, right? Like they're not the vast majority of the American population who were left out and left behind and ignored and not relevant. It wasn't, JP Morgan and like Standard Oil running the show. Like now we actually have the opportunity for other people to engage in our political system. So I think folks making that range of argument about how lobbyists now have entree is fundamentally ahistorical. It is the opposite of the way things work. As it is now, there is many more points of access, and you don't have to be super rich and super wealthy to be able to influence the political system. Now, whether that's the best result is a different question. But transparency is not the cause of why Congress is dysfunctional, which is what they're trying to saddle it with. And their premise is fundamentally unprovable. I can tell you, if you do certain set of things, you can see what the outcomes are. You can't see the outcomes in their scenario. Congress becomes a black box. Well, we don't know if these are good or bad results or how we got there, whether there's more things that were good that were possible, because you can't see how it happened. Right? Like that's the fundamental problem is you don't see what the choices are, you don't see what the trade-offs are. The other side of this is there are always limits to transparency, right? We don't have the great, my kids like Calvin and Hobbes, like things that allow you to Calvin has this device where you can read other people's thoughts. Like that doesn't exist, right? You can't beam into a member of Congress and listen to them think, gee, I wonder what I'm gonna have for lunch. Like you can't do that. And members can always go and talk. They can go and talk in the committee rooms that are private. They can have phone calls that are private. They can meet in each other's offices that are private. They do it all the time. There's plenty of space for people to have quiet conversations around what they want to do and the trade-offs that they want to make. They don't have to do it purely in public and purely performative. They can always go into the back rooms. But what it is now is once they make their decision, the vote is public. The issue is public. Like Congress holds many voice votes. The reason they hold a voice vote is so people don't have to go on the record, so you don't have to see how they vote on an issue, whether they vote for or against it, if it's a politically difficult vote. And that is fine, right? That is a fine result. So there are trade-offs that are made with respect to transparency in terms of how you can hold the proceedings and where you can hold them. But what transparency does is it widens the number of people who are able to understand and participate in the political system. There are people who think that our political system should be fundamentally elitist, where only a handful of folks can participate. That is a fine and historically grounded belief in the United States. That is where our political system comes from. But I think very few people would think that we should have a very narrow elite that is running what's going on, and transparency largely, but not entirely, acts as a corrective force so that more people are able to engage in the political system than could do so otherwise. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but hopefully that like addresses that contention.
Well, no, it's good. What about this concept that, you know, in the committees in particular, where at least some people think there needs to be the debate and discussion going on, maybe some of those conversations need to be more private. And the fact that they, you know, that since that's been opened up or doesn't happen, it's moved to leadership where it's much less transparent, right? Like in the leadership offices or in the parties where you don't have that requirement of transparency, where they can create a bubble of privacy. And so all the negotiations or the power, you could say, moves to those darker places. You know,
Yeah.
is it just a whack-a-mole game we're playing here and moving the power out of the areas that are transparent into these other worse areas?
I think that's conflating two different things. One is, can you have the private conversations to work something else? The second is leadership's gaining undue power. I think those are two separate things. And transparency has often been a corrective to leadership gaining power. So like the example of the Democratic Study Group that I identified before had to do with like dispersing power to folks. Like transparency is a tool. It's not it's not you know, an end in of itself. But if you're the committee chair and I'm the ranking member, we can always go and have a quiet conversation. They do it all the time. And I've sat in committees where the committees have real conversations. The press doesn't necessarily cover it. I was just watching a hearing before I came to talk with you for the Senate Legislative Branch Appropriations Subcommittee. And the members of the committee were talking with each other on video, remotely. It didn't impede it. It wasn't a highly politically salient issue, but that's okay. These quiet conversations, these agreements, these amendments, this stuff happens all the time. It happens all the time, particularly in the appropriations process. The problem of leadership gaining undue power is because they've taken control over the political structure. The way the Rules Committee has changed, in the House in particular, the leadership's control over legislation that can go to the floor and those types of matters, like that is in part what changed things. It was Newt Gingrich's elimination of congressional staff, reducing it by 20%, killing off a support office. It was the elimination of the congressional member organizations where they could get together and collaborate. And there's a number of other things sort of attended to that, as well as the increased strife that comes from fundraising, that you can raise money by being particularly antagonistic. Those are the things that have driven power up. And also the fact that people don't realize that we don't just have a two-party system in this country. The Democrats and Republicans each compose multiple parties inside them, and they should be able to recombine. So the people who are pro-privacy and the Democrats and the pro-privacy Republicans should be able to work together. But leadership doesn't allow that, generally speaking, to happen because they want to retain their power. Speaker Pelosi and her Republican and Democratic predecessors are unduly powerful because they've been able to control the reward structure for who gets to be a committee chair and who gets to be in leadership and who gets to get their bills to move and how much money they're going to give them for what they're fundraising. That is what's fundamentally narrowed the scope of power in the House and in the Senate. It isn't transparency. Transparency, if anything, is an antidote to a lot of the problems that we're having, although it wouldn't necessarily and fully resolve sort of this set of questions.
Great. Well, why don't we move on to what we call our lightning round of questions, where I ask people, everyone who comes on asks the same things, and ultimately we can compare the answers. If you're ready for that, we'll move on to those.
Please.
So the first one here is, what do you think congressional representation should mean?
It should mean that people have a voice in their political process. They view it as legitimate, that the people who are engaged in representation fundamentally believe in democracy. It doesn't mean that they have to give up their viewpoints or be conciliatory. There's nothing wrong if people are fighting in the legislature. But at the end of the day, when a decision is made, people need to abide by those rules, and those rules need to have and be seen to have legitimacy.
So for a member, there's this concept of, when they represent their constituency, are they representing those beliefs or what they consider to be their interests over the long term? Where do you fall out on that spectrum?
You do both. And it varies depending on the issue based on how strongly you feel as an individual and how important it is to your constituency. And it's really an issue by issue basis and how you balance that.
So I'll ask you, since you're so ready with an answer, a little
I've heard this one before.
tougher version of it, which is, what about future generations in the constituency? How are they represented compared to people who are currently living in the district, and how do you reconcile this future constituency from the one that's living today?
Well, in part, I think that you should be, so a couple of things. One is, I think you should be thinking about the country and not just about your district or your state. So there is a balance that exists there as well. And I think that we have an obligation to be good stewards of what we're dealing with, not just for now, but for the future. And that means that you have to be thinking about questions, environmental questions, for example, are the perfect example of this. There are all sorts of tragedy of the commons issues that we run into. And you have to be cognizant of now and the posterity. And it's a balance. And how you strike that balance really depends on like your personal values and what your constituents elected you to do.
Great. Next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not sure that it's the right question. I think I would address it more as like how does it balance its different obligations? Because you have to do oversight, you have to do legislating, and you have to deal with your constituents. And I think that time is a question of funding, that more money means more people, which gives you more time. So I would address it by having more funding, so that you can have more staff, so that you can do all the different things at once. So it's not a fair answer to you, but like it's the best answer that I have, is so that you can do the different tasks simultaneously.
And what about home versus the district versus Washington? Do you have a position on that?
But can you tease that out a little more?
So yeah. So for instance, right now there's the Tuesday to Thursday or Friday thing. How much time should they be spending under normal circumstances? Forget the pandemic for a minute.
Yeah.
How much time in Washington versus home?
So I've done the research on this. It's kind of interesting. I would actually have two or three full weeks in and then 2 weeks back, and I would have them as bigger blocks. If you do that, there are currently 80 travel days. It would eliminate 60 of the 80 travel days. It would give you a whole bunch of additional days in DC and a whole bunch of additional days in the district. So I would actually have blocks in place so that people aren't going back and forth all the time, and that would significantly increase time. I would also continue the committee week process that we're seeing now, where there's no stuff on the floor, but there's committee meetings. I don't have a problem with people deliberating in part from other places than DC, as long as there's also deliberations that happen in DC. I'm not of the mind that you can't build relationships online. I haven't seen you in a long time, but like we can still have a relationship, through the screen. It's not the same, but it's not unreal either. I think some of this is like a mentality of like, if you're older than a certain age, you think, oh, I can't make friends on the internet. But under a certain age, like you've seen that, it's a different story. So I think that we need to combine these different modalities. So I would change the travel schedule so that it allows people to be more present wherever they are. And I would build the congressional calendar around what is the nature of the work that they need to be doing and where are the different places that they can do it.
And so you don't have a split on the oversight versus legislative work.
I think they drive each other. Like in a perfect world, in a world with a working Congress, right? Oversight and legislating would drive each other. Like you find the problems, then you decide whether Congress, like legislating, is the right solution to deal with that problem. They sort of push each other.
Got it. All right, great. Well, my next question, I think you've already addressed it a few times here and there, but how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress?
Well, I don't think it works at all now, right? Nobody watches each other's speeches. Nobody, generally speaking, listens to each other, except in narrow circumstances that we discussed previously. I don't think like congressional debate is meaningful, right? It's just a bunch of people giving 3-minute speeches or something, and it's just like it's boring as hell. Or questions for witnesses where it's the same question again and again and again and again. I think that there are real ways to foster collaboration and discussion on these types of things. I think that having staff asking the questions, I think about having blocks of questions. I think that there's like other ways to do some of these things. But with right now, the process is driven, sorry about that, by leadership. And what that means is that debate doesn't matter.
So how should it happen? How should this collaboration happen?
I would decentralize power from leadership. I would make committees more meaningful.
So have the debate be happening or the dialogue or discussion happening in committees?
In committees and in subcommittees. I would be recreating congressional member organizations so that people who have affinities can more easily talk to each other. I would be trying to break the parties down into their constituent factions and letting the factions be able to recombine with each other on particular issues. You should be able to win if you get a majority, right? Like that should be the thing that lets you win. And it shouldn't matter who it takes to get you to make that majority. And I think that creates a more stable political system as well. If you have no permanent parties, but you have permanent like alignments of interest, I think that creates like more durable stuff. So like I would be looking at that, and when people have an incentive to collaborate with each other, where it's not about like kissing the ring of leadership, but like you actually need the other side to get somewhere, the incentives change, and people will respond rationally to those incentives.
Next question is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
I'll give you 2 years. How's that? They should triple their staff and double their pay to start. They should probably increase member pay by 50% and index it to inflation. That would probably be another good place to go. You shouldn't be looking for your next job when you're working in there. Things that are impossible that we should do, we should have a constitutional amendment, say against having relatives of members of Congress be able to run for Congress. I'm fundamentally anti-aristocratic in that respect. It's only partially tongue-in-cheek. We need to redress the role of money in politics. You shouldn't be able to win because you're wealthy. Income or wealth should not be a factor. Just as like relationship with people who are politicals probably shouldn't be a factor. I think that we need to rethink how members of Congress engage with their constituencies. We need to rethink the pipeline by which people become members of Congress. We probably need to fundamentally reform and change lobbying and how it functions. There's nothing wrong with lobbyists, but they should be purveyors of information, not of influence. And I think we need to fundamentally change that to a large extent. I think there's probably more like resources that need to be given to Congress so it can also better understand what's being asked to deal with. I think that's not 50 years, but like that's, next 5 years. And those would significantly change what we engage in. The final thing that's really hard to deal with is how do you get them to think long-term instead of short-term? I have a whole bunch of really boring white papers I could send you that discusses that issue, but we probably don't have time to address it at the moment.
We'll link them.
Yeah.
Next question is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to reform in Congress?
So there's a book called Bureaucracy. It was written by Wilson, a political scientist. And everything in it I disagreed with. I thought it was fundamentally wrong. But it was really interesting to follow sort of the thought process about like how he was describing the way he thought that Congress worked and the way the legislative branch worked. So I think that was probably pretty influential. Actually, the other thing that was really influential was probably the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov, because it was about looking at arcs of history and not about individuals, which led me to start thinking about incentives for people and how you structure the polity or the society changes the incentives for those that operate within. And in the congressional context, in our political system, that's certainly true. I mean, there were a lot of things that were wrong or just sort of silly in that book or those series of books, but like I thought that was it was a useful way to start thinking down that path.
Excellent. Last question is about your plans. You know, what are you going to be focusing on over the next few years? What are your goals and ambitions?
Uh, Addressing the congressional staff pay and retention issue, addressing technology inside the legislative branch, thinking about better ways for people to collaborate, and continuing to build bridges with people who don't have my particular ideological perspective. Because I can't change this alone. It has to be a collaborative effort, and there has to be something in it for everyone, which means that we have to figure out how to incentivize people to want to have a democratic system and to have it work well for them. And that means finding pieces that fit right there, to 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 bring us back from the brink, which is where I think we are now.
Daniel, thank you so much for joining us.
Such a pleasure. Thank you for talking with me.